Chapter 3, Communication Principles for Group Members. Preview. Define communication and explain the 5 major characteristics of communication. Describe the difference between listening and hearing. Describe the 4 listening preferences and explain their implications for small groups. Describe paraphrasing as a technique for active listening. Discuss the ways technologies are used in groups. So communication, what is it? So communication, see definition of it is transactional process of simultaneous creating, interpreting, and negotiating shared meaning through interaction. So we've got multiple ways people communicate. And this is something a lot of times we often assume it only happens through verbal. No, it does not. It happens multiple ways. You have symbolic, and this is arbitrary that stands for something else. And I'll give you an example. When you see symbols or you see people do gestures or you do things like that, what does it mean? Watching that. Personal meaning is in people. So you have people that communicate personal ways. And I would tell you this, when you see this personal, that's to include certain groups of people communicate certain ways. To break it down to even smaller, certain families even communicate certain ways that nobody else would know exactly what that means because they don't communicate that way. These family members will interact with each other, communicate, and it means something to them, but it doesn't mean anything to anybody else, or it's confusing to others. Transactional. Simultaneously creating mutual understanding. So this is something whereas when I do something, you do something, but we both know what that means. When I do this, you know to do that. When I say this, you know to say that. Shared meaning is a responsibility of all groups. So this is something when you have a shared meaning that everybody understands what that is, what that means. That's not something that someone has to guess to try to figure out, well, what does this mean? We all understand what that means. And I'm going to give you an example. A lot of times you may find this in where you may have working groups and teams at work. People that work together in a group or work together in teams. And they have that. Involves content, what, and relationship, how, dimensions. So when you look at the content, it's what we're talking about, and the relationship is how, the dimensions. So you're looking at the what and the how. And that's 2 parts right there. When you think of that, what are we talking about? Now, we could be talking about something, but you may not understand what it is. But someone else in the group or someone else I'm talking to, they does. The relationship, how, the dimensions you look at, and how does it work within the relationships? How does it affect that? You may read it one way, someone else may read it a different way. The transactional process. So transactional has 2 major meanings relevant to communication among members of a small group. So when communication is simultaneous, multi-directional process. So when you look at a simultaneous multi-directional process, you're looking at something that's going back and forth with multiple individuals and it's going in multiple different directions. But this is not something that's happened by chance. This is actually its functional, and this is how it actually works. And everybody's on the same sheet. Again, a great example of that is working in teams, in groups. Or let's use sports, for instance. When you have people who are on the team and they have different roles that they play, communication and stuff, when you're communicating between each other and stuff, what your roles are. But communication is going in multiple different directions. And where you really get a chance to practice, to utilize this, is doing your practice. Transactional implies that members get together, create mutual understanding for what words and concepts mean nicely, complements the interdependence between the members. So when they're talking about the transactional process, they understand what it is. And I'll be honest with you, I have seen some groups and teams, or have the opportunity to listen to or observe some groups and teams that said and did some things that was not necessarily that I understood. But I never had an issue with it because they understood it. And it was how they worked and how they did things. And my thing is this: if what they're doing is achieving the results, then I have no issue about how they go about doing it as a leader or a manager. Now, if it's not working and not getting results, then we'll have to take a look at this transactional process. Listening, receiving, interpreting, and responding to messages. So this is something that's vitally important. So when you're listening, is a four-step process that begins with perceiving a message, then interpreting it, deciding what it means, and finally responding to it. So listening is not the same thing as hearing. Hearing is the physical process of receiving sound waves, but listening is an active process that also involves paying attention to and interpreting. So many times people hear what you say, and many times you'll find out they may not be listening. And so you see the basic difference. Yeah, hearing and listening is not the same thing, and oftentimes people mistake that for someone who's hearing them, and they assume that they're listening, and they may not. And this is why they don't get the message fully, or get the message and or interpret it wrong. There are four main listening preferences. People-oriented listeners focus on relationships. So this is something when if you're studying people, if you're in a position or in a job where you're required to get to know people or study people, and I give you one prime example is people who may be in the field of psychology, or people who may be in the field of law enforcement and interviewing criminals and things along those lines. One of the things that you find is they have to get really good at learning people and reading people. And so some of the things you look at is people-oriented listeners focus on relationships. That means a lot to them. Sometimes you hear it referred to as touchy-feely. Action-oriented listeners focus on the task. This is something I notice with a lot of people in the military, in the Army, where action-oriented listeners focus on the task, at hand, because at the end of the day, it was about getting a result, and it was the polar opposite of touchy-feely. Content-oriented listeners analyze information. So people who, I think of people who are really good at that, people who are like intelligent analysts. Or if you've seen these TV shows with police officers and you see the people who are running the labs and tracking down the individuals and finding out their real names and getting the fingerprints and stuff, this is what I would consider to be content-oriented listeners. And they analyze information. Or if you're working at a bank and you have people who are bringing stuff together, the technical aspects of it and stuff, listeners are analyze information. Time-oriented listeners focus on time management. And this is something that I found as I became a leader in the U.S. Army and I got higher up in management. That was one of the things I had to be more conscientious of. Being time-oriented listeners, focus on the time management, because I was looking at a bigger picture versus people below me looking at a task. I'm looking at the overall operation, and time management was very significant, and someone had to monitor that, and I actually had to grow into that role, and other people will too. You may not naturally be that way, but it's something that you can evolve to by virtue of the position that you hold. Listening, receiving, interpreting, responding to messages. So listening type, people-oriented. A listener who is concerned about how her or his listening behaviors affect relationships. So they're really concerned about kind of like how people feel about the relationships and stuff. Here's a disadvantage. They can be distracted by others' moods. And here's another thing I would say about that. You can get distracted too because they focus too much on how they think others, how much their actions or decisions may affect relationships. And I'll give you an example. If you're a manager and you're managing a group and one of the members of the group is your beer drinking buddy and he's not doing his job or whatever else, versus you actually have a situation where you're dealing with him in a manner which you should, you may find yourself that, you're letting him slide a little bit and because you're concerned about how it affects the relationship. Action-oriented, a listener who is concerned about how her or his listening behaviors contribute to the task at hand. So that is a definitely advantage. Disadvantage may appear overly critical, tune out when discussion seems aimless, and interrupt if the discussion gets off track. They can be so focused on their action and task at hand that they don't listen to a lot of the other things that may be important. And I'll give you an example. Sometimes it's your people. For instance, if you have someone in there that's having a rough time because she may be going through a divorce or whatever else, if someone's heavily oriented in action, they may be willing to overlook that. It's like, bottom line is leave your personal business at home. When you come to work, I expect you to work. And When it comes to people, a lot of times we just can't turn emotions and things off like a light switch. Content oriented, a listener that prefers information from perceived credible sources and is drawn to analyzing information he or she hears. So this is someone, like I said, when I think of this, I think of people who are really content oriented, and I thought were good at their jobs. They were people who were in jobs that required them to analyze information, to gather and analyze information and pass it on to others. Seems overly critical, intimidating, and dismissive of unknown sources. I do know that some of those people I'm referring to, how they were good at the job, I do know when they had some shortcomings too. And some of the shortcomings where they could be dismissive of others at times, and also sources of information. And I realistically, that's what made them good at what they do, but it also left a deficiency there as well. And for that very reason, some of those people did not make it into management because of that, because it was considered to be like a gaping hole. Time oriented, a listener that values time and is focused on efficient discussion. So you see how the advantage is, the disadvantage, it may stifle creativity by expressing impatience with creativity and spontaneous discussion. So realistically, in time oriented, they want to hurry up and get something done. And they want to get it done in the least amount of time so they can go to something else. Well, and a possibility of doing that, here's some of the things that they may stymie, is creativity. Well, if somebody is creative, well, let me think of a couple of different ways we may be able to do this. Well, I'm someone who's heavily time oriented. I'm like, well, we don't have time for you to sit around here and look at 10 different ways to do it. We've got 2 ways. We're going to look to decide between these 2. So you can see the advantage of it. It keeps things moving, but you can also see the disadvantage of how it could actually stymie creativity and sometimes be a little narrow in scope. Habits of poor listeners. Now, this is something that, if the truth be known, this is probably most people. And when I say that, I don't mean all the time, but in many instances. Pseudo listening. And this is pretending to listen. They're looking, and they're nodding their head, or they're shaking their head, and they're agreeing and whatever else, but they're not listening. And one of the ways you would find out is if you were asked that person, okay, now break down what I just told you and tell me how you took this, how you processed this, or what did I just say? You may find it they may not be able to do it. Silent arguing, and this is mentally refuting the speaker. So this is really like, they're listening, but they're silent arguing. They're dismissing everything the speaker said, but now nobody hears this. That's what's going on inside the head, between the ears. Assuming meaning. Using own cultural rules to interpret meaning. So when you think about a situation and someone's in it and they're assuming meaning, they're using their own experiences and their cultural experiences or their education background, whatever, to draw their own conclusion, to interpret the meaning, when realistically it's not about them. And because they do that, it's kind of like this: because I don't like tomatoes, nobody else likes them either. And I know that's being simplified right there, but I'm just being, that's assuming. I don't like tomatoes when most people don't like tomatoes. Well, that's false. I have no clue what most people like, but I do know a lot of people like tomatoes. But that's my cultural thing right there, my personal hang up. And so realistically, I'm going to be biased when it comes to that type of stuff. Focusing on irrelevancies, distracted by dress, accent, physical appearance. So I'll give you an example. If you have someone and they're working with it, and here's an example, just within the United States, if you take someone who was born and raised in the Northeast, who has a strong Northern accent, and someone who was raised in the Deep South, who has a deep Southern accent, and you put them together and they're working together, and then the guy from the Northeast comes back and says, I can't work with him. I can't stand his accent. They can't get past that, so they're focusing on irrelevance. It has nothing to do with his accent. Does he know what he's talking about? And I actually had to deal with this before, and it was cultural, where you had guys from the inner city and guys from the mountains that was having to work together, and they were struggling. And I had to intervene in the Army with that situation because that was irrelevant. My thing was, do y'all know your job? Then we're not going to have these type of distractions in the workplace. Sidetracking, changing the topic. And this is what you'll find sometimes people do if they're not really feeling what you're talking about. And they'll try to change the topic and transition to something else or in another direction. And that's something if someone's really experienced, they know how to handle this. For people who are not very experienced, that can be very challenging. Defensive responding, failing to listen and feeling threatened by what the speaker said. A lot of times when you get defensive responding, it's because in some way or some capacity, the person feels that you have attacked them or questioned them. Question their authority, question their knowledge or their competency or whatever else. And now they're failing to listen because they feel threatened in some capacity or belittled. And realistically, you're going to run into problems just about every time that happens. We guard against these by being active listeners and paraphrasing information. So being active listeners and paraphrasing information. So, and I'll give you an example. When you, if you give me a brief and you tell me something, and I say, okay, Mike, okay, if I'm understanding you correct, you're saying this. Bam, 1, bam, 2, bam, 3, bam, 4, bam, 5. Is that correct? He's like, yes, that's correct. Active listening and paraphrasing the information back to him. Communication principles and technology. So you have computer-mediated communication. Takes many forms and is referred to as CMC. Of course, we have the email. It's for personal and business. We have chat room discussions. I see a lot of the chat room discussions where you have people who are talking about various types of things of topics of interest. I don't see them so much in the workplace. I see them primarily for social, where I've seen them. Electronic bulletin boards, where you can post things within the organization, put it on electronic bulletin boards where people can access this information regardless where they are. Listservs. This is something where you actually utilizing the internet and have a group of people who are actually, let's say, spread out throughout the world, but by them virtually having access to the listserv, they get information. As information goes into the listserv, it's automatically sent to everybody who needs to get it. Net conferencing is when you're actually speaking with someone over the phone, but you actually have something going on interactive over the internet through the web that actually they can actually interact and watch as you're speaking over the phone. Texting and tweeting. No need to comment about those. Everybody knows what those are. Communication principles and technology. So regardless of how the group chooses to communicate, communication rules about listening, treating one another with respect, and having ethical remain the same. So a lot of times when there's breakdowns in communication, you have situations where there's a miscommunication, someone's not actively listening, someone didn't verify. You have situations where you have people who are, I'll give you a prime example. I knew a person one time that was really horrible in a leadership position, but really horrible about communication because he had a tendency to speak down to people. When you speak down to people, they feel like you feel like you're better than they are. They have a tendency to tune you out. And this is something that we really had to address with him to get him to understand it. If you're trying to get people to do stuff, you got to talk to them on a level playing field. You can't be on a mountaintop talking down to them. Using polite, appropriate computer etiquette, and being ethical when you get higher cooperation from other group members. So another thing is, how are your emails and how are your texts? How do they read to others? Did you write something in a haste to say one thing, but it's interpreted another way because the way you wrote it, it came off as being aggressive or offensive, or belittling, or disrespectful, or questioning someone's competence? If you did, there's a high probability you won't get the best result from that. And there may be fallout from it. And I've known people who actually, and this happens sometimes, be cognizant of this. Sometimes this happens with people who are actually, English is not their first language. So what happens is, they're not trying to be disrespectful, belittle, or question your competencies, but something gets lost in translation and it's not translated right because they are primarily think in another language and they're actually English is a second language. So when they communicate in a text or email, it comes across one way, but that's not what they intended. And a lot of times if you find out, if you talk to them about that, they'll let you know that what they intended. it's because they're not that their grasp of the English language and the written English language is not that great yet. They haven't mastered it. That concludes this chapter.